G'day, this is Chris Savage from Ariel Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Jeremiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Thanks for coming along. We're into session 20 of the book of Jeremiah. We're looking at chapter 30, verse 23 down to chapter 31, verse 30. Last session, we just finished off with the restoration of Jacob. We saw that God was going to bring the tents of Judah. Remember, tents means temporary dwellings. So Judah is going to be brought back from her temporary dwellings into the land. Cast your mind back. Israel will be scattered during the tribulation, and she flees to Bozrah down in southern Jordan, where they will dwell there for the last 3.5 years of the tribulation. And it's away from their permanent residences. That's why they're in temporary abodes, which are tents. God says that he'll have compassion also in Jacob's dwelling place, which is the land of Israel. God's going to rescue Jacob from the place where he's dwelling temporarily, and he's going to bring her back into the land, or bring him back into the land of Israel. And we also saw last session that all the cities will be rebuilt in the promised land. They're going to be rebuilt upon where the previous cities were. There's going to be great rejoicing in the land, and there's going to be a population increase in the land. Israel as a nation are going to be glorified. What does that mean? It just simply means that they'll no longer be counted unworthy among the nations. They'll no longer be the smallest among the nations, but Israel will have a glorified place amongst the nations. God will also punish all who oppress her, meaning the Gentile nations. The new leaders we see are no longer going to be Gentiles, no longer Gentile domination, but they're going to be Jewish leaders, and the princes are going to arise from amongst their own people. They're going to have one special leader, and this leader shall approach God with boldness. Now, there's only one person who will be able to approach God with boldness and righteousness, and that is the Messiah himself. And where God says, he says, "You shall be my people, and I will be your God." So Israel is going to be regenerated, and she's going to sit under righteous ruler, Messiah Jesus. So that's a quick skip of what we had last session. Okay, now we're looking at the wrath of God from chapter 30, verse 23 to chapter 31, verse 1. Chapter 30 ends with a repetition of a statement Jeremiah made back in 23, verse 19 to 20. And that was that the future did not hold peace, but judgment. Now, this truth was never known to the false prophets, right? But it was known to those who stood in Jehovah's counsel. Why? Because the false prophets were always prophesying peace. The wrath of God is found in verse 23. "Behold, the tempest of Jehovah, even his wrath is gone forth, a sweeping tempest. It shall burst upon the head of the wicked." So it is described as the tempest of Jehovah. So Jeremiah compared Jehovah's wrath with a sweeping storm that would whirl around the heads of the wicked. And actually, this verse was we saw it earlier on in Jeremiah 23, verse 19. Same verse, similar verse. In verse 23, he describes the wrath of God. In verse 24, he now describes the fierce anger of Jehovah. "The fierce anger of Jehovah shall not return until he have executed, until he have performed the intents of his heart." Jeremiah 30, verse 24 is a repeat of Jeremiah 23, verse 20. So Jeremiah 23, 19 and 20, these are a repeat of Jeremiah 23, 19 and 20. So the wrath and anger of Jehovah would not turn back until the judgment has run its course. Judgment is the means to save Israel. That's what one of the purposes of the tribulation is, to save Israel. Then he points out, "In the latter days you shall understand it." So what he's saying here is that the understanding of this judgment will finally come in the latter days. Remember, the latter days is the prophetic future, and in this instance, it's the Great Tribulation. They'll understand, Israel will understand that the judgment was the means of bringing her to salvation. And that is what they'll understand in the closing days of the tribulation. Now, specifically, according to Hosea chapter 6, verses 1 to 3, in the last 3 days of the Great Tribulation, the Jewish remnant will indeed understand why the tribulation's judgments have come upon them. They'll understand it to have come directly as a result of the rejection of the Messiahship of Jesus. But for the but it's also for the purpose of bringing them to salvation. And it's Hosea chapter 6, 1 to 3. You can have a look there. Now, verse 1 of chapter 31, at that time, says Jehovah, will I be the God of all the families of Israel, and they shall be my people. So in 31, verse 1 is the salvation of Israel. And at the same time, well, at the time, meaning what time? What time is he talking about? This is the time of verses 23 and 24 of chapter 30, when they understand all this in the latter days, in the time of the Great Tribulation. God will be the God of all the families of Israel. So by mentioning all the families, he points out that all 12 tribes will participate in the final salvation and restoration, and they shall be my people. Jeremiah 31:1, just for your own interest, Jeremiah 31:1 in the Hebrew Masoretic text belongs with Jeremiah 30. So Jeremiah 31 verse 1 is actually Jeremiah 30 verse 25 in the Masoretic text. It doesn't make any difference to the interpretation. It just for your info. Okay, we see God's love and promises to Israel in verses 2 to 6. So the results of judgment in verses 2 to 6, the results of judgment followed by salvation will now bring about God's love and promises to Israel. In verse 2, he emphasizes Israel's survival. Thus says Jehovah, the people that were left of the sword found favor in the wilderness, even Israel, when I went to cause him to rest. So people who survived the sword, this is the 1/3 of Israel who survived the tribulation. They're also called the faithful remnant. This 1/3 found favor in the wilderness. And the wilderness here is the same as the wilderness of Ezekiel 20, verse 35. It is the wilderness of Revelation 12, verse 16, and verses 13 to 14. It is the wilderness of the land of Edom. That's where Bozrah is. It is where the city of Petra or Bozrah is located. And this is where the remnant of Israel will be saved as a nation. The people who survived the sword found grace in the wilderness, even Israel, when I went to give him rest. So he emphasizes here the nation of Israel. Jeremiah is not speaking of the church or anyone else, but the nation of Israel. And the term rest, which we see here, I went to give him rest. The term rest here refers to salvation rest. So in dealing with the overall context of what happens in the tribulation, the remnant of Israel who survives the sword in the wilderness, where Israel will be hiding in Petra or Bozrah, according to Micah chapter 2, verse 12 to 13, it is there that Israel as a nation will find salvation. And this is where Paul says all Israel will be saved, which means all the 1/3 of Israel who survived the tribulation will be saved, which is what we see here. They'll have salvation rest. Oh, by the way, verse 2 here is actually 31 verse 1 in the Masoretic text. We won't bother to tell you that anymore. Okay. Now, in verse 3, he deals with God's everlasting love for Israel. He explains the reason for Israel's survival in verse 2. Jehovah appeared of old to me. Now, what does this mean? It means that the truth that Jeremiah is about to express was actually revealed to him and all the other prophets, the good prophets, that is, the faithful prophets, quite some time ago. Jeremiah was not suddenly given a new revelation on this subject. Other prophets have spoken on this in the past. Jeremiah himself has spoken of this earlier where he says, yeah, I have loved you with an everlasting love. So God has expressed this fact periodically and systematically throughout Israel's history. God is always telling her that he loves her. He has an everlasting love for the people of Israel. And when we did Hosea, that's the theme of the book of, that's one of the themes of the book of Hosea. The theme of Hosea is God's love for Israel, which is eternal. I have loved you with an everlasting love, means an eternal love. So in light of God's everlasting love for Israel, Israel cannot help but survive. Love does not mean that we hold back on punishment. For parents, you know that if parents love their children, then they do not hold back from disciplining them. If we truly love the children, then we discipline them in measure and restore them to family fellowship. And this is true in God's relationship to Israel here. God loves Israel with an everlasting love. Therefore, he must not leave her unpunished. He has to discipline her, and he will discipline her in measure. And he promises final, eventual restoration. Therefore, with loving kindness, I have drawn you. So Jehovah next stated that he drew Israel with this hesed, his loyal faithfulness. Hebrew word mashak, is it there? I said this often refers to the drawing of love to itself. So the love of God will eventually draw Israel to himself, to itself, to the love he has for them. And this, in fact, you can have a look at this aspect of love. You can find it in the Song of Solomon in chapter 1, verse 4, where love is described here between a man and a woman. And in Hosea 11, verse 4, as in Jeremiah, it refers to the love of God toward Israel. So that's Solomon 1:4 and Hosea 11:4. So God's love toward Israel is such that he will continually draw Israel to himself until Israel is finally restored. In verses 4 to 5, God now presents three basic promises to Israel. First up, in verse 4, Israel will be built. Again, I will build you, and thou shalt be built, O Virgin of Israel. So when Israel is thoroughly cleansed from her sin, she will no longer be viewed as an adulterous wife, as she was in the earlier chapters of Jeremiah. She'll be viewed as a virgin again. And Jeremiah makes this statement in other places, like Jeremiah 14, verse 17, 18, verse 13, and 31, verse 21. Now, all this is possible because of what is said in Jeremiah 31, verse 34. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin will I remember no more. So God is going to cleanse Israel of all her sins. They will be forgotten and remembered no more, and Israel will once again appear before Jehovah as the virgin Israel. Then there'll be a reunification between the wife of Jehovah and Jehovah himself. So that's the first thing. Gonna build, cleansed of sin, gonna build again. Now, second, Israel will rejoice in verse 4. Again shalt thou be adorned with thy tabrets, and shalt go forth in the dances of them that make merry. So Israel is looked upon now as having a pure, white, spotless bridal gown to go out and to make merry with others. She'll no longer mourn over her desolated state, but she's now going to be rejoicing over her new purity as the virgin wife of Jehovah. And then third, in verse 5, Israel will plant. Again shall thou plant vineyards upon the mountains of Samaria. Planters shall plant and shall enjoy the fruit thereof. Now, what we see here, he says the mountains of Samaria. Samaria is not in Judah. So the final restoration will not only include Judah, but it's also going to include Samaria in the north. And so the planters are going to plant and enjoy the fruits thereof. So Israel, north and south, would plant, and her enemies in the past would invade during harvest, and they would steal the fruits of Israel's labor, but no more. It's not going to happen again. Israel shall plant, and now she's going to enjoy the fruits of her labor. It's all going to be for her. Then in verse 6, Jerusalem is now going to become the center. For there shall be a day that the watchmen upon the hills of Ephraim shall cry, arise ye, and let us go up to Zion unto Jehovah our God. So this will be the day of the messianic or millennial kingdom. So a day would come when certain watchmen who are typically stationed in high vantage points along the city walls to warn of an approaching enemy, they're going to invite people to now come to Jerusalem. And the Hebrew word for watchman here, it's Natzrim, N-A-T-Z-R-I-M, and it comes from the root word natzah, meaning to watch, to guard, or to keep. This is in biblical Hebrew. In modern Hebrew, the term is used for Christians. Just by the by. Now, the reason that one would travel to Jerusalem is that God's presence would be in this city. Jeremiah 3 verse 17 indicates that Jehovah will visibly and physically reign from Jerusalem during the millennium. No longer will the Jewish people be tempted to visit the former centers of idolatry such as Dan and Bethel. Instead, Jerusalem will become their center of worship, and they'll realize that to visit Jerusalem is to enter God's physical presence. Why? Because God will reign physically from Jerusalem in the person of Jesus the Messiah. So, just quick summary. In the final restoration, Israel will be characterized by great productivity. Because of God's everlasting love for his people, he intends to restore and rebuild Israel. Once again, there's going to be a time of plenty for Israel, and the hills of Ephraim will echo with the call to come and worship God in Jerusalem. Wonderful time. Okay, return of the remnant. We're going to see the regathering of the remnant in verses. Return of the remnant in 7 to 14. We're going to see the regathering of the remnant in verses 7 to 9. Okay, in verse 7, we have God's declaration. For thus says Jehovah, sing with gladness for Jacob, and shout for the chief of the nations. Publish ye, praise ye, and say, O Jehovah, save your people, the remnant of Israel. The expression, the chief of the nation, literally means in Hebrew, the first of the nations. So the Hebrew term for chief, Rosh, means head, R-O-S-H, means head. And Jacob is described as having become the head of the nations. And the triumphant return of Israel and Judah is now accompanied by jubilant shouts. Why? For Jehovah has delivered his people. And then in verse 8, he describes the gathering itself. Behold, I will bring them from the north country and gather them from the uttermost parts of the earth. So that places of the gathering will include, first of all, the north country. Now, north country, this is the area of Babylon. And then second, from the uttermost parts of the earth. So this will include the entire earth. Now, this regathering was not the return from Babylon, because we see here it's going to be a worldwide regathering that will be done on a worldwide basis. It's from all in the uttermost parts of the earth. And then this verse goes on to describe the conditions in which they will return. And with them, the blind and the lame, the woman with child, and her that travaileth with child altogether. So, in the great company of these returnees, there'd even be people weakened by disabilities or pregnancies. Not even the most infirm and unfit persons for a journey shall be left behind. Not even the pregnant woman. Now, the pregnant woman, the woman who travails with child, she's already in the process of giving birth. They won't leave her behind. She comes as well. He says, a great company shall they return hither. They would be able to make the long trek back to the land from the uttermost parts of the earth, because God would strengthen them and supply their needs along the way. First part of verse 9, he gives a description of the regathering. They shall come with weeping, and with supplications will I lead them. I will cause them to walk by rivers of waters in a straight way wherein they shall not stumble. So what does weeping indicate? Well, weeping indicates repentance. We're grieving over something that we have done. Jehovah declared that he would lead his people with supplications, meaning that the return to the land would be the result of their prayers. The fact that Jehovah would make his people walk by rivers of water indicates that Israel would have a means of sustenance. He would provide for them. Also, we see all the obstacles in the way of Israel's final return would be removed, so no one's going to stumble. Everyone who's heading back will make it back into the land, because God guarantees that. Now, the reason for this graceful return to the land is God's wonderful, beautiful relationship with his people. For I am a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. Okay. Now, verses 10 to 14, we see the rejoicing of the remnant. So we see verses 7 to 9. He talked about the regathering of the remnant. Here he deals with the rejoicing of the remnant in verses 10 to 14. Verse 10 presents God's declaration. Hear the word of Jehovah, O you nations, and declare it in the isles afar off, and say, he that scattered Israel will gather him and keep him as a shepherd does his flock. The nations, they're the Goyim, they're the Gentiles, and they are called to make a declaration in the farthest reaches of the earth. God's declaration is as clear as it can be here. He that scattered Israel will gather him and keep him as a shepherd keeps his flock. Now, this verse is very clear here, okay? It teaches that the amillennialists, the ones who say there's no millennium, replacement theologians are wrong, right? The amillennialist sees no future for Israel and claim that the church has taken over the promises God once made to Israel. That's what they say. The amillennialist believes that the promises for Israel are fulfilled in some spiritual way in the church. But what does this passage tell us? Right? They fail to observe passages like this one. They take the scattering of Israel literally, but then they try to allegorize away the statements of Israel's regathering by saying God meant that spiritually. So I'm going to scatter them physically, and I'm going to gather them spiritually. That's not what God is saying. In this verse, the two statements are brought together very clearly, stating, he that scattered Israel, that's God, will gather him and keep him as a shepherd does his flock. Pretty clear. In verse 11 is the reason for the declaration of verse 10. For Jehovah hath ransomed Jacob and redeemed him from the hand of him that was stronger than he. Whoa, who's he talking about? He's redeemed Jacob. He'll ransom Jacob from the hand that was stronger than Jacob. So we can understand the phrase, the hand of him that was stronger than he. So that we can understand it, we must consider the wider prophetic context of this passage, okay? In its context, the phrase refers to the Antichrist of the tribulation period, because this is the period of Israel's future regeneration and restoration. So, reigning from Babylon, Antichrist will be the last Gentile ruler over Jerusalem. He is the one who is dominating the Jews and Jerusalem. He's the one who's trying to destroy the Jews. Now in verse 12, so God delivers him from the hand of he that is stronger than Israel, Jacob. So in verse 12 is the rejoicing over God's provision. And they shall come and sing in the height of Zion, and shall flow unto the goodness of Jehovah, to the grain, the new wine, to the oil, and to the young of the flock and of the herd, and their soul shall be as a watered garden, and they shall not sorrow any more at all. So the results shall be that their souls shall be as a watered garden, and no more sorrow at all. In verse 13, the rejoicing of the remnant is now described. Then shall the virgin rejoice and dance, and the young men and the old together. For I will turn their mourning into joy, and will comfort them, and make them rejoice from their sorrow. So what we see here is that God would turn the grief of his people into gladness, into joy. In response, virgins, young men, the old men, they're all going to rejoice together in the dance of joy and merriment. The entire picture now ends in verse 14 with a note of deep satisfaction. And I will satiate the soul of the priests with fatness, and my people shall be satisfied with my goodness, says Jehovah. So the Jews will be totally satisfied with the goodness of God as described in verse 12. Okay, the comforting of Rachel, verses 15 to 22. In verses 15 to 17, we have a specific promise of comfort here. Verse 15 describes the weeping of Rachel. Thus says Jehovah, a voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are not. Now, verse 15 describes the weeping of Rachel. It's a voice that is heard in Ramah. What kind of voice is it? Well, it's a voice of lamentation and bitter weeping. So the place where this bitter weeping and lamentation is heard is in a place called Ramah, R-A-M-A-H. It was a town in the tribe of Benjamin on the border between Israel and the southern kingdom, Judah. It's around about 8 or 9 kilometers north of Jerusalem, about 5 miles north of Jerusalem. Now back, bit of history. In Genesis 35, 16 to 20, we're told that Rachel, who was Jacob's favorite wife, was buried on the road to Bethlehem. Genesis 35, verse 19. And Rachel died and was buried in the way to Ephrath, the same as Bethlehem. So she was on the way to Bethlehem. Jacob set up a pillar upon her grave, the same as the pillar of Rachel's grave unto this day. So these verses in Genesis, they do not say that she was buried in Bethlehem, but that she was buried in the way or on the road to Bethlehem. She didn't make Bethlehem. She's on the road somewhere. This is the road that goes by way of the town of Ramah, which is north of Jerusalem. It also continues down to Bethlehem, which is south of Jerusalem. So Rachel died on that road after leaving the town of Bethel. Bethel is also north of Jerusalem and north of Ramah. Bethel is a border city between northern kingdom, southern kingdom of Israel and Judah. So Bethel was the most southern city in Israel, the northern kingdom. And for that reason, the first king of Israel, Jeroboam I, set up one of his rival altars in Bethel. Now, Genesis clearly tells us here that Rachel died after leaving Bethel, while she was a long way away from Bethlehem. So Ramah is somewhere between Bethel and Bethlehem. Well, we'll get to the point shortly. There's actually a building in the town of Bethlehem called Rachel's Tomb, which Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, they revere it as the burial place of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel. But biblically, that's not the place. She's not there. But it's good for tourism, I guess. Another passage on this question about, where she's buried is 1 Samuel 10, verse 2. When you departed from me today, then you shall find 2 men by Rachel's sepulchre in the border of Benjamin at Zelzah. So we're told here that Rachel's tomb was near the border of Benjamin. Ramah is near the old Ephraimite-Benjamite border. And from Jeremiah 40, verse 1, we learn that Ramah was the point where the march into captivity began, right? The various Jewish captives would be brought from different areas of Judah and Jerusalem, and they'd be brought to Ramah, and there they would be screened as to who was taken into captivity and who was going to be left behind or killed. Now, in Ramah, the mothers wept for sons they would never see again. So as these Jewish young men were taken into captivity, many of their mothers were left behind. So Jewish mothers were weeping for sons they would never see again. We're told, we see here, Rachel weeping for her children. Now, we're told that Rachel was viewed as weeping for her children. Rachel became the symbol of Jewish motherhood. The children are the young Jewish men being taken into captivity. So Rachel, the symbol of Jewish motherhood, is viewed as weeping for sons they will never see again. She refuses to be, this is verse 15, she refuses to be comforted for her children because they are not. So the reason for her weeping is because her children are not. Now, the phrase here may refer to the deportation or to the sons who would die in the last Babylonian campaign against Judah. It could be either. In other words, mothers are weeping. The Jewish mothers would either weep over the sons that were killed or over the sons that were now exiled to Babylon. Either option is possible when you look at the big picture. Okay, now, verse 15 of Jeremiah 31 is quoted in Matthew chapter 2, verse 17 to 18 in connection with Herod's slaughter of the innocent children of Bethlehem after the birth of Yeshua, Jesus. Matthew 2, verse 17 and 18. Then was fulfilled that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet, saying, a voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she would not be comforted because they are not. The New Testament quotes the Hebrew Bible in 4 different ways. Now, one of which is this one here, which is literal plus application. It was a literal prophecy in Jeremiah, but now we have an application in Matthew's gospel. In the original context, Jeremiah 31:15 is speaking of an event that would occur at the beginning of the Babylonian captivity. Matthew quoted this verse by way of application because we have one single similar point of similarity. Yeah, one point of similarity. Jewish mothers were again weeping for sons they would never see again because Herod had slaughtered all the males of Bethlehem from the age of 2 years and under. So Matthew quotes this verse by way of application, not by way of interpretation or fulfillment, simply by way of application. We have one similar point here, and he quotes it because of that similar point. Mothers weeping for their children. Now, just as there's weeping in verse 15, there's now going to be comfort in verses 16 to 17. In verse 16 is a cessation of weeping. Thus says Jehovah, refrain your voice from weeping and thine eyes from tears. Why? For your work shall be rewarded, says Jehovah, and they shall come again from the land of the enemy. So they're told to refrain from weeping and to keep their eyes from tears. And the reason is that their work shall be rewarded. They shall come again from the land of the enemy. They will return, and we have Jeremiah's favorite word here, the word shuv, S-H-U-V. They shall return. Now, in verse 17 is the reason for the end of weeping. And there is hope for your latter end, says Jehovah, and your children shall come again to their own border. Hebrew word for latter end is a word called acharit. Acharit means the after part or end. Now, a lot of English Bibles actually translate the term as future, as your future end. However, the ASV, the Authorized Standard Version, is a little bit more accurate. It indicates that the return, shuv, of Israel to her own territory will take place in the prophetic future. All right. So the verse does not refer to the return from Babylon, but rather to the final return that was also mentioned in the previous verses. And your children shall come again to their own border. In verses 18 to 20, he deals with the national confession of Israel. Verse 18, I have surely heard Ephraim bemoaning himself thus. You have chastised me, and I was chastised as a calf unaccustomed to the yoke. Now, before the final restoration, Israel's national confession must take place, has to. And verses 18 to 19 deal with the confession itself. God says that he has heard Israel bemoaning himself. So Israel finally admits that God has chastised him, and he was chastised. As a calf unaccustomed to the yoke, so Israel was chastised. Now, Hebrew term here for chastise, the term yasah, means to discipline, to chasten, and admonish. But it can also refer to a training, like a calf that is being trained to wear a yoke. Ephraim was being trained by Jehovah. Hebrew term for the people finally realized here that God had disciplined them justly. Turn you me, and I shall be turned, for you are Jehovah my God. So Israel started pleading that he should bring them back. If he did, they would indeed turn back. And the reason for this plea was Jehovah was their God. Verse 19, surely after that I was turned, I repented, and after that I was instructed, I smote my thigh. So Ephraim again acknowledged that he had turned, Ephraim had turned from Jehovah, but was now ready to repent. And after that repentance, he was now instructed. So having been instructed by Jehovah, Ephraim smote his thigh, spat his thigh as a physical manifestation of regret and a sign of temper. Have a look in Ezekiel 21, verse 17. You see the temper. Here the temper in this instance was shame and humiliation caused by the sins Israel committed in her youth. I was ashamed, yes, even confounded, because I did bear the reproach of my youth. She had brought divine punishment upon herself. And the judgments of the tribulation period would come upon Israel because of these sins. And Jeremiah spoke a lot about these sins back in Jeremiah 2, verse 1, Jeremiah 3, verse 24 to 25. Jeremiah speaks a lot about this. Okay, moving on. Verses 18. So back in verse 18 and 19, we have the confession of Israel. Now in verse 20, we have God's response. God's response is now to ask a couple of rhetorical questions. First of all, he says, is Ephraim my son, my dear son? Yes, he is, according to Jeremiah 31, verse 9. 31, verse 9? I think it is. For I'm a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn, it says. Second, is he a darling child? Yes, according to verse 3, 31, verse 3. Yes, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, with loving kindness have I drawn you. Now, second part of verse 20, Jehovah continued his comforting words by now stating, for as often as I speak against him, I do earnestly remember him still. The word remember has the idea here of remembering for one's benefit. Now, well, in the book of Jeremiah, God has consistently spoken out against Israel and against Israel's sins. Yet as often as God speaks out against Israel, yet for the benefit of his people, he earnestly remembered Israel. As often as he speaks out against them, he remembers them lovingly. So because God always remembers Israel, even in the midst of his divine judgment against him, therefore, his heart yearns for Israel. I will surely have mercy upon him. In verses 21 and 22, we have the call to repentance. Set you up waymarks, make you guideposts. Set thy heart toward the highway, even the way by which you wentest. Turn again, O Virgin of Israel, turn again to these thy cities. How long wilt thou go hither and thither, O you backsliding daughter? For Jehovah has created a new thing in the earth. A woman shall encompass a man. Now, these two verses, God calls Israel to the very repentance which he prophesied would occur in verses 18 to 20. In verse 21, we have a call to set out for home. It's a call to return to the ancient paths. They're told to set up landmarks and to make guideposts. Now, they were to set what they were to do were to set their hearts toward the highway, even the way by which they came. They need to head home. So the picture here is of a road leading home. It's also found in Isaiah 35, verses 8 to 10. Road signs and guideposts were to be installed to help people find their way. Jehovah addressed Israel once more as a virgin, calling his people to return, that is Shuv, the land that was rightfully theirs. Turn again, O Virgin of Israel. In verse 22, there's a call to cease the backsliding. How long will you go hither and thither, O you backsliding daughter? Israel had turned away from God for far too long already. How much longer would she persist in her backsliding? After all, Jehovah has created something new. Now, second part of verse 22, Jehovah has created a new thing in the earth. A woman shall encompass a man. Now, the Hebrew term for created here is bara, B-A-R-A, and it refers to an action that only God can perform. Only he can create matter out of nothing, life out of death, etc., etc. So here, he mentioned that he created a woman who would encompass a man. Hebrew word and root for encompass, savav, it means to turn about, to go around or surround. If you have a look in Deuteronomy 32, verse 10, it says that Jehovah found Israel in a desert land and encircled her, which is Savav, cared for her and kept her as the apple of his eye. Now, the exact meaning of this term is unclear in all of the commentaries I've had a look at. No one can come up with a good explanation. Now, however, verse 22 is often used as a verse of prophecy to teach the virgin birth, but there's nothing here that speaks about a virgin birth. No context has to do with that at all. It cannot be used to predict the virgin birth. Now, in Hosea chapter 1 to chapter 3, Israel is pictured as a divorced wife. As a result of judgments during the period of divorcements, she eventually returns to her husband. A little bit of history again here. Storyline. In Jeremiah 2, verse 20, it is clearly stated that Israel is guilty of having played the harlot with many lovers. In Jeremiah 3, verses 1 to 10, Israel was divorced because of her harlotry. In Hosea 2, 19 to 20, Israel is destined to eventually return to her husband. So this is indeed a new thing in the earth. It is a new thing that a divorced wife who is guilty of adultery and during her period of divorcement continued playing the role of a prostitute, her to be returned to her husband. This is a new thing indeed. Nothing like it. Israel is like a woman who shall encompass a man. The Hebrew term for woman, and nekiva, means a female, and it emphasizes women in their femininity and relative weakness. Hebrew term for man, gever, refers to men in their maleness and relative strength. So the picture here is that the weak female will embrace the strong male, and in the context of the final restoration, Israel, the wife of Jehovah, the weak woman, will embrace Jehovah, the strong man, Jehovah, her husband. That is the new thing in the earth. A nation which is guilty of spiritual adultery, nation which has experienced judgment and a period of divorcement, a nation which practiced harlotry and prostitution during the period of her divorcement is now destined to be remarried in all purity to her husband. That is a new thing that God has created in the earth. Indeed, the work of spiritual regeneration is a work that only God can perform. Now, the future prosperity of Israel, we see in verses 23 and 26, and then this is only going to take place after the national confession of Israel. Verse 23 begins with a word from the Lord. Thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, yet again shall they use this speech in the land of Judah and in the cities thereof. When I shall bring again their captivity, Jehovah bless you, O habitation of righteousness, O mountain of holiness. So Jeremiah now announces the return of a future, saying, yet again shall they use this speech in the land of Judah and in the cities thereof. They'll use this saying again. This means that it was a saying that was used in the past, although it had not been used in recent days. It was probably used back in the glory days of David and Solomon when they were a king over the land of Israel. And it probably fell into disuse after the kingdom split and after the two nations fell into idolatry. In any case, the saying ceased to be used. And in the second part of verse 23, when I shall bring again their captivity, Jehovah bless you, O habitation of righteousness, O mountain of holiness. So when Israel returns to God, when she returns to Jehovah, when a woman encompasses a man, then the virgin daughter of Zion, Israel, will use this saying once again. And the time of this saying is when God shall bring again their captivity. At the final regathering of Israel, when the encompassing comes, they'll use a saying that was used during the days of David and Solomon. The saying is, Jehovah bless you, O habitation of righteousness, O mountain of holiness. Mountain of holiness has to do with Mount Zion, on which the temple was built, Mount Moriah. Habitation of righteousness probably has to do with the same mount, although it could actually mean Jerusalem in general. So that's the saying they're going to be using. Jehovah bless you, O habitation of righteousness, O mountain of holiness. 24 to 25, he now deals with the reason why this saying will return. And Judah and all the cities thereof shall dwell therein together, the husbandmen and they that go about with flocks. For I have satiated the weary soul, and every sorrowful soul have I replenished. So the blessing would return because of Judah's prosperity. Farmers and shepherds would resume their daily activities. And then the second reason is that God would give the Israelites contentment and a sense of completion. Verse 26, we have now, there's a bit of a break here. It's interrupted now with this little interlude here in verse 26. This is Jeremiah speaking. He says, upon this I awaked, Jeremiah said, and behold, and my sleep was sweet unto me. Now, what that means is that Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 1 to 31, verse 25 were revealed to Jeremiah in a dream. Because he said, I'm awakened now. That dream was indeed sweet to him. What he is saying is the opposite of what he has been proclaiming in the previous chapters. He had been proclaiming that judgment is coming. But now he's given the revelation concerning the final restoration in the dream, and his sleep is sweet to him because it's there's going to be a fantastic time coming. He awakens momentarily in verse 26, and he recognizes the wonderful revelation that God is showing him or giving him. And just as quickly, he dozes again. And in the remainder of his dream, he sees chapter 31, verses 27 to 40. In verse 27 to 30, he continues to dream, and now he deals with the theme of building and planting of Israel. In verses 27 to 28 is the sowing. In verse 27, behold, the days come, says Jehovah, that I will sow the house of Israel and the house of Judah with the seed of man, with the seed of beast. So this sowing includes both houses, Judah, southern kingdom, Israel, northern kingdom. Behold, the days are coming, prophetic future. This is the seventh time that he's mentioned this phrase. I'll give to the house of Judah, to the house of Israel. Now, we have some figures of both judgment and blessing here. The seed of man, the seed of beast are mentioned. What does that mean? It means he's going to repopulate the land of Israel with Jewish people and animals. Parallel, check it out in Hosea chapter 2, verse 21 to 23. God will sow both houses of Israel with a divine sowing. Verse 28, it shall come to pass that, like as I have watched over them to pluck up and to break down and to overthrow and to destroy and to afflict, so will I watch over them to build and to plant, says Jehovah. So he tells about the watching of God. God watches for both judgment and blessing. And the verbs that describe the judgment are pluck up, break down, overthrow, destroy, afflict. Verbs that describe the blessing are build and plant. So just as Jehovah had watched over the process of judgment, he's going to watch over the period of blessing as well, the period of growth. In verse 29 to 30, there'll be a change to one of their proverbs. In verse 29 is a proverb that will be removed in the latter days in the kingdom period. In those days they shall say no more, the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. This was the complaint of those already sent into captivity. Ezekiel chapter 18 verses 1 to 4 tell us that. They were misrepresenting a statement in the Mosaic law found in Exodus chapter 20 verse 5, Exodus 34 verse 7, Numbers 14:8, and Deuteronomy 5:9. Your slide has 9:5. It's actually chapter 5 verse 9. The point of these passages is that the sins of the fathers would be visited upon their children upon till the third and fourth generation. Okay, now, this principle does not mean that the children themselves were innocent. Had they been innocent, then God would not have visited the iniquities of their fathers upon them. What they're saying by that proverb, when they say that their fathers ate sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge, is that they are being punished for the sins of their fathers. These guys in captivity in Babylon believed that the sins of the fathers were placed upon the innocent children, but they were guilty as well. They were guilty as well. An example by way of application is the present state of Israel today. The Jews in the present state of Israel go on saying that the reason we're still being dispersed is because of the sins of the fathers. This is true. However, it is also true that the present day Jews are guilty of the same sin. The dispersion of AD 70 came as a direct result of the rejection of the Messiahship of Jesus. Many Jews today live in the dispersion as a direct result of that sin. However, except for Hebrew Christians, Jews in general still reject the Messiahship of Jesus. So while it is true that the sins of the fathers were involved, the children are also guilty. If the children are innocent, God will not visit the iniquities of the fathers upon the children. The iniquities of the fathers are visited upon the children because the children are also guilty. This is the proverb that the Israelites in the Babylonian captivity were using, but that's going to change. In verse 30, he introduces a new proverb which they'll use. In first part of verse 30, he first states the principle upon which this new proverb will be based. But everyone shall die for his own iniquity. Because of this principle, the new proverb would state that each person destroys his own teeth by eating sour grapes. Every man who eats the sour grapes, his teeth shall be set on edge. In other words, they are suffering not because of the sins of past generations, but because of their own sins. And that's where we shall leave it for this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.